Hello, today's video will be on one of William Wordsworth's famous sonnets upon Westminster Bridge. Actually, I'll be doing this poem, which is on London, together with another poem also on the City of London by William Blake, and then perhaps we can compare and contrast them in the second video. But this particular video will be just on Wordsworth's sonnet upon Westminster Bridge, set in London. So first the poem. Upon Westminster Bridge, earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendour valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. So, rather interesting poem. And actually, it fills the reader with a sense of serenity and exaltation. The first line, earth has not anything to show more fair, obviously praises the scene. And typically of romantic poets, Wordsworth speaker says, dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. So the emphasis on the individual soul, the romantic soul, capital R, not small r, nothing to do with love, unless you're talking about love of nature. So the romantic soul with a capital R is obviously moved by this sublime sight, which happens to be London at dawn. So in the next line, this city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Notice the effective simile or comparing the dawn to a piece of clothing which London has put on. And this piece of clothing is beautiful because it captures, or it consists of, the beauty of the morning. So very interesting, very effective simile there. It reminds me of Shakespeare's similes or on clothing in Macbeth, in the tragedy Macbeth. But of course that's used in a completely different context, because in Macbeth, clothes or kingly robes don't sit so well on Macbeth since he murdered to get his crown. And so the idea of ill-fitting clothes in Macbeth is of course in contrast to what Wordsworth says here, which is the perfect fit of beautifully made clothes on the City of London. So silent, bare are very good uses of diction, emphasizing how there is no noise in this scene. The list of things, ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples, of course, you could argue, describes the skyline, the shape of the city created by the different buildings and vehicles. Now actually ships, according to Dorothy Wordsworth's journal, who's his sister and also was present in this scene, actually it was a multitude of boats that they saw. Notice how Wordsworth elevates this into ships, which gives a more majestic and refined and even a streamlined shape to the scene. Towers, domes, theatres, and temples, of course, are architectural marks of civilization and of urban life. Theatres, obviously, London is famous for its theatres. Which again harks back to the time of Shakespeare, when theatre became a key form of art for Britain, for English literature. So open unto the fields and to the sky suggests the harmonious conjunction of urban and rural. How the city of London seems to merge with the fields and also to the sky. So for once, there isn't a contrast between a beautiful countryside and an ugly city, and of course, oftentimes the destruction of beautiful nature by industrialization. Here, they seem to be together in a kind of harmonious blend. And to emphasize how there is a lack of pollution, Wordsworth uses the diction smokeless in the phrase smokeless air, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. So in the morning, London is bright and beautiful when the polluting fog hasn't settled. So that's a lovely picture. And then the sonnet goes on, never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor, valley, rock or hill. Of course, you would argue there's a personification of the sun, since the masculine pronoun his is used in his first splendor, a valley, rock or hill. Again, first splendor suggesting something pristine and original, something pure. And of course the speaker, perhaps Wordsworth himself, exclaiming, never saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. So the River Thames is moving along quietly at his own pace. And when he exclaims, dear God, that's not necessarily the Christian God. It could be a pantheist, a very nature and all-encompassing nature with its own soul. That's in the concept of God. So not really the orthodox notion of God. And of course, this notion of the importance of the soul, actually Wordsworth and other romantics, both in England and Germany and different European countries, later influenced Ralph Emerson, the American writer, who was, by the way, recently quoted, not so rightly, by President Donald Trump. Because Emerson also has this notion of the important role of nature and its relation to the soul. Right. So the last two lines of the sonnet, dear God, the very houses seem asleep and all that mighty heart is lying still, compares the core of London, a great metropolis, to something alive, something with a beating heart, which at this point in time, during dawn, is lying still. So it's a beautiful sonnet, but long time ago there was a critic called Cleanth Brooks, I believe that's his name, who didn't kind of interpret the poem in the way you might have expected, because he faulted it for lacking quote-unquote nobility of sentiment and brilliance of imagery. Brooks argued that the poem gets its power from the paradoxical situation out of which the poem arises. There's a sense of awed surprise because he sees a man-made city wearing the beauty of nature, and what is mechanical, in other words, the dead city, suddenly alive at a moment when it is asleep and yet has the semblance of death. So according to Brooks, Wordsworth was consciously presenting the poem as a paradox, and Coleridge, who was Wordsworth's good friend, was even quoted to show that Wordsworth wanted to quote unquote give the charm of novelty to things of every day. But a lot of people have rebutted this argument as very tenuous, and that this interpretation of the poem is contrived and incorrect, because what Brooks calls the tired old metaphor, which sees the city as a pulsating heart of empire, is not really that at all, and the heart is really collectively the whole population of London and even of humanity. And the paradox that Brooks misses is that life is at the moment suspended and so still that the very houses seem asleep. So the only paradox is that it's alive and yet not moving. So different critics, of course, have rebutted this in different ways. And London, of course, is not usually described like that, because Wordsworth had unpleasant experience of cities, which obviously reminded him of, quote unquote, the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world. And this urban hustle and bustle is, of course, in the sonnet upon Westminster, totally absent or still. So, and that's the whole point of it, because the sonnet is showing a city integrated with nature. Yeah. So this kind of harmonious unity is what makes the sonnet a perennial favorite, actually. So the harmony of nature, usually in contrast to human striving, that harmony, that absence of conflict and turmoil is very beautiful and peaceful in this sonnet. So that's the more typical response, I think, to this particular poem. And of course, criticisms that it's not realistic, actually, of course, there is some realistic detail in the listing of the towers, the domes, the theatres, and the temples, which arguably represent civilized values, which in this poem are in harmony with the beauty of nature. So that's, according to another critic, interesting, masterly exploitation of the connotative values of words. So the details are not huddled indiscriminately together, nor are they deficient because they lack realism. These things, meaning the towers, the domes, the theatres, and temples, are all selected to suggest positive human values, and they are not just denotative symbols of the physical aspects of the city. So that's another kind of reply to negative comments from people like Clint Brooks. So the other thing to note, I think, is the detail that actually the detailed information that actually Wordsworth mentions in a letter to John Wilson regarding how he hopes his poems can cultivate human feelings, quote unquote. A great poet ought to do more than just describe or express the feelings of human nature. A great poet should, quote unquote, rectify men's feelings to give them new compositions of feelings, to render their feelings more sane, pure, and permanent. In short, more consonant to nature, that is, to eternal nature and the great moving spirit of things. So I feel that Upon Westminster is a poem that actually does this. It's a great therapeutic pill, for those of us who are urbanites, and for those people who are still caught in the rat race. This is the kind of thing that one is grateful to literature or to art for, that moment of peace, that moment of serenity, that purification of an emotional attitude due to the depiction or the offering of an ideal experience. This kind of ideal experience is, I think, indeed made possible by the Westminster Bridge sonnet. It's full of a certain illuminating insight, because what's presented is an ideal harmony between human beings and nature. So lacking, of course, in today's world, what with the hoo-ha about climate change and political conflicts between the US and other countries in the context of climate denial and so on. So I think this is a really beautiful poem with a nice keynote of harmony, and so it's justifiably one of the perennial favorites. Thank you.